Racial Religious Imagery and Psychological Confusion by Naeem Akbar, PhD, Clinical Psychologist. One of the persisting problems affecting us as a people is the lack of understanding of what our real needs are. Probably the most devastating thing that has happened to us is that we do not know what our agenda ought to be. This discussion identifies one of the serious problems facing the African American people and suggests the need for emergency action in order to alleviate that problem. We have spent much of the last 100 years fighting at what was the surface of a problem. Because we were operating at the surface, we had no sooner cut down the underbrush than it grew back, consuming us again. Our problems were literally Sisyphean, perpetually rolling the stone of social, political, and psychological resolution to the summit, only to have it rolled down, and we begin the arduous cycle all over again. You may read books such as The Strange Career of Jim Crow by C. Van Woodward and discover that what is happening in the social and political environment right now at the close of the 20th century are essentially the same events that were occurring at the close of the 19th century. There was a similar time about 100 years ago when African American people thought that freedom had been acquired. With political enfranchisement and the aid of some other people helping us to set our agenda, we had more African Americans in positions of political power 100 years ago than we actually have today. Reconstruction in the South produced more political power for African Americans than we have had since. The presence of African Americans in positions of political power throughout the southern United States and even parts of the North was a common occurrence before the end of the 1800s. In less than 10 years' time, the Jim Crow laws were enacted, and we found ourselves in almost the same political condition that we were in prior to 1865, or worse. Subsequent to 1865, we had the illusion of freedom, which made the disenfranchisement even more cruel than to the slave, who was clearly defined as without rights. It took almost 100 years to get the Jim Crow laws removed to bring us right back to where we were 100 years before. Then along comes the political changes of the 1980s, which have threatened to reverse many of the political gains made in the prior 2 decades. These changes are combined with a mentality that is not unlike the heavily racist one which had reached a fever pitch at the time of the establishment of the Jim Crow laws. The fact that the clock can be so easily turned back, and we repeatedly find ourselves trying to correct problems which were supposedly resolved, may suggest that we are not appropriately recognizing and or dealing with the real problem. Such regressions would probably not occur if we were not perhaps dealing with symptoms of the problem or superficial manifestations of a deeper problem, which, like the weed whose root is left intact, soon rises again to choke the life from the garden of progress. The nature of our problem is quite serious and represents a deeply embedded psychological malady. We need something more than an aspirin to remove the symptoms. We need massive corrective surgery on the brain. Religious imagery. Students of the mind have not adequately dealt with the influence of religious symbols and imagery on the thinking of people. Perhaps the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung is a distinct exception to this statement, for he has discussed in considerable detail the importance of symbols in general, and religious symbols in particular, on the thinking of human beings. He argues for their relevance to psychological and mental health and also identifies the impact of their absence or distorted occurrence. Jung does not, nor does any other psychologist, discuss the specific impact of these images or any religious imagery on the psyches of African people. It is important to keep in mind that the image of God which a people has will determine the expanses of their mind. If people have a narrow image of God, then their minds are narrow. If people believe that the biggest reality is a tree, then that is the extent to which their minds can aspire. If one believes that the biggest that God can be is the river or the lake, then that is as big as that mind will be able to reach. Such an image prohibits you from conceiving of the ocean which feeds the lake, and if you cannot conceive of the clouds which feed the ocean, then your potential for understanding truth and the competence which comes from truth is limited. The people with a limited or narrowed concept of God then have an automatically limited and narrowed psychology. If you have come from a small rural town and you have only played against 140-pound football players and you won your varsity letter every year, then you really believe that you have great powers within that limited context. If you then happen to find yourself at a major university where the lightest man on the team is 190 pounds, then suddenly you are forced into another reality. Because your point of comparison was with 140-pounders, your capacities are only understood within that limited context. If you were capable of doing more, you would not know it until you got into a broader sphere. There is a young man I know who was a triple jumper on the university track team. For the entire year, he had been trying to jump farther than his record he had set in that region, which was 52 feet. In each meet, his competition would jump 47 feet, 49 feet, or 50 feet. He could not get beyond 52 feet because 52 was the best he could do under the pressures that were available, and his own record was the best image that he could find to influence him. He eventually went to the national meets, and the fifth place jumper jumped 53 feet. You can imagine what the first, second, third, and fourth place jumpers had done. Suddenly, this young man, who had desperately reached for greater distance all year long, jumped 54 feet, 6 inches, surpassing everything he had been able to jump all year, and he did it repeatedly throughout the entire meet. What had happened for my friend was that his imagination had been expanded by his experience with bigger images, and his capacities had consequently been expanded. The implication of this is that the mind's possibilities are limited by its concept of its potential. Human potential is broadened or limited by its concept of God. Thus, if God is anything finite, that is, limited, then you have already limited your mind. However, if God is infinite, without limits, without boundaries, without deficits or definition, always greater than, then you have already expanded your mind to reach for the horizons of all things. Such a consciousness of God puts us into the proper field to grow to our greatest height. This idea constitutes the basic reason why any finite image of God is in fact limiting to our psychology. The problem only multiplies as we begin to attribute other limited characteristics to the deity. But to have a concept of God that can be put into a limited frame, a limited image, a limited idea, then it automatically limits what your mind can do and where your mind can go. Imam Warith Deen Muhammad stated once in a public lecture that if you can put God into a frame, then you have got him and he does not have you. If you can hang him up on your wall, then he belongs to you. You do not belong to him. You can take his picture, put it in a frame, lock him up in a room and do whatever you want to do. However, if God is going to be God the ruler, the creator, the maker of all things, then he cannot be put into a limited frame. The question of particular characteristics begins to raise a whole variety of questions. We could develop a discussion around any number of problems which arise from this anthropomorphic idea, that is, creating God in man's image. For example, there are considerable problems in making the deity quote unquote man as opposed to quote unquote woman. If God is just a man, then that means that there are 50% of human possibilities that God is not. This means that you have cut off God's possibilities and limited your concept. You have introduced an unnatural psychology into those who are women, who would see themselves less favored because God is of a different gender. The purpose of this discussion is to look at a particular characteristic that has been assigned to God and some of the consequences of that set of characteristics on the psychology of people everywhere that this image has gone. We want to study the impact of racial characteristics which have been attributed to God. Impact on the psychology of the portrayed race. There is a serious psychological problem created for the person portrayed in the form of the divine image. Since the focus of our discussion will be the impact on those who are not so portrayed, it is important to begin with this perspective to suggest that the problem is clearly not unidimensional. The person who looks up and sees his physical characteristics shared by the deity begins to develop the idea that he is exactly like God, or that God is like him. This is all right if one sees potential for growth within that idea. The confusion of the physical attributes with the very nature of God begins to make the person feel that his particular physical features have endowed him with automatic claims to divinity. Such a person can begin to believe in his own mind that, quote, I am God, I am the deity, I am the creator, end quote. He begins to believe that the blonde hair and blue eyes that are on the portrait are his qualifications for divinity. This begins to cultivate an egomaniac. They begin to suffer from ego inflation. Such thinking is very characteristic of paranoid persons, those people who believe that everybody is out to get them, which they explain as a consequence of their being superior to other people. They seriously misrepresent themselves, overstating their own importance. Then they begin to misperceive everybody's own importance. They then begin to misperceive everybody else. This is a major characteristic of the mind that begins to believe that it is supposed to rule the world. Hitler, possessed by the image of a blue-eyed, blonde-haired deity, was convinced that the Aryan race was the superior race and that everybody else needed to be destroyed. Napoleon could not rest until he had conquered and subdued the whole world because he felt that he was like the Caucasian image that was exhibited throughout his society. We can look at country after country, Belgium, Portugal, France, England, where the sun used to never set, and we find maniacal conquerors who felt they had a divine right to rule because they were, quote unquote, like God. This is revealed in their conviction that conquering was necessary to civilize the quote unquote heathen, pagan, barbaric world. End quote. Meaning, anybody who doesn't look like us is heathen because we are the ones who are gods. They were people possessed by an unnatural and deluded image of themselves. From the Amazon to the so-called Middle East, we still find this assertion of divine right to own and rule. They think they are God. In Palestine, some refugees from Europe walked in and said, quote, God said this is our land. This is the promised land. He promised it to us. He looks like us and carries our national identity. This is our homeland, and you are supposed to give in and submit. End quote. The ultimate story is that the image or concept of God, being like a particular people, endows them with an unnatural perspective on themselves and others. Now, let us look at this very carefully. We do not want to suggest that God should not be conceived as one who can affect all people in any condition. We do not want to believe that somehow God is incapable of elevating all men. All men can be reached by God. Nor should we confuse God's capability to reach any of us with the belief that we are God. The problem that has been created for the Euro-American mind, which has led him to become an imperialist, a slave maker, a colonialist, an oppressor around the world, is rooted in this idea that made him believe that he was the Caucasian image that he had identified as God. He believed that this gave him the power and the right to do whatever he wanted to do. It began to destroy the person's natural humility and submissiveness to the superior God force. One of the things that helps us correct our problems naturally is an understanding that though we have great strength, we also have real limitations. One of the things that lets human beings come back into balance is a realization that there are things that naturally limit them. If you go too long, if you run too hard, you get tired, and you have to come back and get some rest. If you eat too much, you get a stomach ache, and you know you should not eat too much. If you watch TV too long, you get a headache, and you know you should not watch so much of it. But once the person gets an inflated idea of who he is and what he is, then he does not have the capacity to naturally correct himself. He begins to do things that ultimately destroy himself. One of the reasons that the use of intoxicants has led to so many disasters is because the drunken driver loses the natural capacity to correct himself. The drunk driver finds himself going 80 miles per hour, and he feels like he is only going 40 miles an hour. He sees a stop sign, and he thinks that it is 2 blocks away. Too late, he realizes that he is upon it. He runs it, hits someone, they are killed, and then the mistake is realized. The sober person, with a realistic sense of himself, is able to say, okay, here is the stop sign, let me stop. They see it, respond to it, act and do what is necessary. They are equipped to naturally correct themselves and regulate their behavior. But one of the things that happens when one unrealistically perceives what he is that he begins to create a situation whereby he cannot naturally correct himself. The European world is on the verge of self-destruction because it no longer has the capacity to correct itself. It has gotten somehow consumed by its own consumption because it cannot naturally correct and regulate itself. It has made itself hated by nations around the world because it cannot naturally correct its addiction to excess. They are drunk on the idea of being like the image that they portrayed as God. The effect of racial religious images on African Americans. For African Americans, racial religious imagery is even more devastating. We have demonstrated that the one who sees himself in the divine image is given an unnatural and a very inflated notion of what he or she is, which develops a kind of egotistical maniac. What is even worse, though, is what happens to the one who is not portrayed in the divine imagery, and who worships a non-self in the image. In Judeo-Christian imagery, this means that the Caucasian bows down and worships himself, and the African American worships the Caucasian as a god as well. Over 100 years ago, a brilliant African Christian theologian and student of the social sciences wrote a very important document. It is a document that has been obscured by time because of the revolutionary and important insights contained in the document. Even African and African American historians have failed to deal seriously with one of the most perceptive and brilliant historians in modern times. The Cambridge graduate Edward Blyden wrote the document entitled Islam, Christianity, and the Negro in 1888. He observes, "No one can deny the great aesthetic and moral advantages which have accrued to the Caucasian race from Christian art through all of its stages of development, from the Good Shepherd of the Catacombs to the Transfiguration of Raphael, from rough mosaics to the inexpressible delicacy and beauty of Giotto and Fra Angelico. But to the Negro, all these exquisite representations exhibited only the physical characteristics of a foreign race, and while they tended to quicken the taste and refine the sensibilities of that Caucasian race, they had only a depressing influence upon the Negro, who felt that he had neither part nor lot so far as his physical character was concerned in these splendid representations. A strict adherence to the letter of the second commandment would have been no drawback to the Negro. To him, the painting and sculpture of Europe as instruments of education had been worse than failures. They have raised barriers in the way of his normal development. They have set before him models for imitation, and his very effort to conform to the canons of taste, thus practically suggested, has impaired if not destroyed his self-respect, and has made him the weakling and creeper when he appears to Christian land. It was our lot, not long ago, to hear an illiterate Negro in a prayer meeting in New York entreat the deity to extend his quote-unquote lily-white hands and bless the waiting congregation. Another, with no greater amount of culture, preaching from John chapter 3 verse 2, "We shall be like him," etc., he exclaimed. "Brethren, imagine a beautiful white man with blue eyes, rosy cheeks, and flaxen hair, and we shall be like him." The conceptions of these worshippers were what they had gathered from plastic and pictorial representations, as well as from the characteristics of the dominant race around them. It is important to note that Dr. Blyden, over 100 years ago, was writing about the problem we are facing today, and the characteristics that he identified are exactly the things we have to deal with right now. The most obvious problem that comes from the experience of seeing God in an image of somebody other than yourself is that it creates an idea that that image, that person, is superior and you are inferior. Once you have a concept that begins to make you believe that you are not as good as other people based upon the assumptions we have already established, your actions follow your mind. If you have your mind set in a certain way, then your behavior follows precisely the program of your mind. The content of this program determines who we are and what we are. So if you have internalized the view of the deity and the Creator as being in flesh, having a nationality and physical characteristics different from yourself, then you automatically assume that you are inferior in your characteristics. The sense of inferiority is not in the form of the quote-unquote natural humility which we discussed, but you begin to believe that you have less human potential than one who looks like the image. The stage is now set for the cycle of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You believe they are superior and that you are inferior, and sure enough, you will start acting inferior. You begin to dress inferior. You begin to see inferiority. You begin to think inferior. You begin to have families that are inferior. You become economically inferior. You become academically inferior. You begin to follow the program. The first psychological necessity of making someone into a slave is to make him believe he ought to be a slave. One of the first methods for making someone act in an inferior way is to convince him or her psychologically that he or she is inferior. Once that is done, the job is completed, because people proceed to live out the prophecy just as they should. This stands as the foundation of many other kinds of problems that we face as a people. The interesting thing is that Euro-American psychologists are fully aware of the impact of such images on the self-esteem of people. The psychological literature well documents this phenomenon. Research by both the Euro-American psychologists and their students, certain African-American psychologists, such as Dr. Kenneth Clark, support this notion. As far back as 1939, Dr. Clark and his wife did a study and demonstrated that little black children, as early as preschool, faced a major psychological problem, and that was that they did not like being black and did not see being black in a very positive light. The Clarks gave 3-year-old children black dolls and white dolls and asked them, quote, "Which of these dolls is pretty?" The children chose the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Caucasian doll. When asked which doll is smart, the same Caucasian doll was selected. Asked, which one would you prefer to play with? The same Caucasian doll. Asked, which one would you like to look like? The same one. Asked, which one is ugly? The one that looked like the 3-year-old black child was selected. This study was published in 1939. The problem is not a new one. The problem has been here for a long time. Then, in the 1960s, came a time for change. One of the first things that the activists began to question was the fact that the textbooks, the actors on the TV and in the movies, even the mannequins in the store windows did not look like us. The black sociologists, the black psychologists, the black theologians, and the black educators said, "We must change these textbooks and make the books have characters that look like us." Hundreds of concerned black scholars and activists produced all kinds of data to show that the school books needed not only little white Dick and Jane with spots, but they needed little black children as well. Everyone from the merchants to Hollywood were warned that blacks would not patronize them if our images were not represented in their products. Justifiably, we wanted black faces wherever African American people were being influenced. The compelling evidence that the Caucasian image problem is so serious is that of all the things that were identified as leading to this negative self-image, almost no one. Footnote: the distinct exception is Reverend Albert Cleage, who established his shrine of the Black Madonna Church in Detroit in the early 60s as a statement against the influence of this Caucasian image of God on African Americans. Though he identified the authentic African contribution to biblical history, he concluded by substituting a limiting black image for the limiting white image. We must admit that his innovation was more healthy psychologically than the prevalent white image. End of footnote. Dealt with the most obvious factor, that the highest power of all was represented in Caucasian flesh. They objected to Santa Claus. They objected to the Dick and Jane characters with no black playmates. They objected to the fact that there were no lawyers, no doctors, no nurses, no professional people on the television. They objected to all of these things, but they did not object to the fact that their children were sitting down at 2 years old and younger, being taught, "This man with blond hair, blue eyes, pale skin is the Savior of the world, who died for your sins, and he is your God." Black children sit at their dinner tables where black daddy and a black mama have often overcome racist opposition to provide them with food, and over the table there hangs a picture to which they bow their heads, looking at 12 Caucasians sitting around their table at the quote-unquote Last Supper. There sits God's Son and all of his closest companions, and not even the cook, the server, or the busboy is shown to look like them. God's quote-unquote mother, the Madonna, is Caucasian. All of God's friends are portrayed as Caucasians. Michelangelo went all out and portrayed God himself in the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel with a long white beard to match his long white face, and the heavenly hosts were all portrayed in the same flesh. Few people saw this as a problem. Instead, the problem was Dick and Jane, Raggedy Ann, or Donald Duck. The problem was not identified as being where the root of the problem really is. Perhaps the most disturbing fact is that this Caucasian image of divinity has become an unconsciously controlling factor in the psychology of African Americans. Brilliant scholars of the mind, usually so perceptive, were unable to see this influence. Their fear of accepting it even after it was pointed out demonstrated the presence of a mental barrier to addressing this issue. Some of the most verbal critics of racism and its consequences have been thoroughly incapable of addressing this issue. The evidence of the potency of the effect is in the inability of even the most militant thinkers to openly challenge what they had come to believe unconsciously was actually the image of God. Now, if the experts had this problem, just imagine what your poor grandmother was dealing with. Imagine what your 12-year-old son is dealing with, he who has already gone through 11 years of Sunday school pictures. Imagine what you are dealing with, even though you think you have been out of it for 4 or 5 years. Let us understand that this problem has to be dug up from the root. The image is so pervasive in the society that even though one may never have been in a church, we would not be able to escape the influence of the image. The assignment of particular characteristics to the Creator is one of the most destructive ideas in the world today. This is probably why even the sacred Judeo-Christian scriptures specifically enjoin, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them." And the Quran states, "Say, O people of the book, come to common terms as between us and you, that we worship none but God, that we associate no partners with him, that we erect not from among ourselves lords and patrons other than God." Let us look at another quote from Edward Blyden in this regard. "Wherever the Negro is found in Christian land, his leading trait is not docility, instead it is servility. He is slow and unprogressive. Individuals here and there may be found of extraordinary intelligence, enterprise, and energy, but there is no Christian community of Negroes anywhere which is self-reliant and independent. On the other hand, and there are numerous Negro Mohammedan communities and states in Africa which are self-reliant, productive, independent, and dominant, supporting without the countenance or patronage of the parent country Arabia, whence they derived their political, literary, and ecclesiastical institutions. So, it is said here, 100 years ago by a Christian theologian, that one had to go to Islamic African countries to find people who were independent in their thinking. Once you begin to believe that the deity is somebody other than you, then you are put into a psychologically dependent state that renders you incapable of breaking loose until you break the hold of that image. Though we are 100 years up from slavery, we still govern none of the institutional forces that affect our lives. There is no independent black African American institution that is independent both in thought and control. The frightening fact is that we control absolutely nothing. Our token presence on city councils or even mayoral offices does not mean that we are in control. We do not control the water flowing into the faucets. We do not control the lights. We do not control the buildings. We do not control the paved streets. We do not control the gas, the food. We do not control anything that affects our lives. But what is worse, we don't even care. We do not care that we don't control anything, and furthermore, we are defiant in our dependence. If someone comes along and says, be independent, you say, oh, you're a radical militant, revolutionary, get out of here. That person making such a suggestion is simply saying what a mama bird says to its baby birds 10 days after they are born, and that is, stand, fly on your own. If we say that to a people 100 years up from slavery and 20,000 years into civilization, they respond, I don't want to do anything like that. We begin to glorify dependence. We have become comfortable being governed by someone else. We are constantly looking for someone else to govern us. Our dependent mentality and actual fear of autonomy leads us to even identify heroes on the basis of their dependence. A hero for us is one who begs more effectively than others. Our heroes are not admired for their independent thinking. We do not respect those people who are most effective in articulating our uniqueness and our capability for self-sufficiency. Instead, we revere people who prostrate themselves to other men on our behalf. Distinguished African American leaders such as Marcus Garvey and Elijah Muhammad are obscured or thought of ambivalently because they called for an independent view of ourselves as a people. Men such as these are treated as minor figures against the great heroes who, quote unquote, begged us into participation in someone else's culture and institutions. Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, General Patton, and other Euro-American heroes were people who advocated Euro-American independence at all costs, even from their own mother country. Any African American who makes a similar demand for African American people is viewed with suspicion and or hostility. The reason for this, at least in part, is because of the psychological dependence which has been fostered by the acceptance of the image of God as Caucasian. Acceptance of this image makes it almost impossible to entertain an image of a self-managed cultural, economic, or political life, as a people free of this influence do quite naturally and quite successfully. Of course, unchecked independence can lead to anarchy and imperialism. Those who identify with the image of God itself feel confident and correct in exploiting the resources of others. With such a mentality, one can comfortably take control over another's resources because he feels that he has a divine given destiny to do so. On the other hand, those under the influence of the alien image feel that they have no claim on any resources. The consequence is a persisting dependency which comes from the mentality which sees the Creator as being identified with another group. One of the persisting difficulties facing African American people is the difficulty to think independently. We are constrained by the perception that thinking and ideas are the exclusive privilege of those who are similar to the image of divinity. Our scholars are limited to imitating the scholarship of independent Caucasian thinkers. We analyze our situation and the nature of the world in general exclusively from the frame of reference of Euro Americans. We approach the solution of problems as if the nature of the problems of the former slave and descendants of African civilization are the same as those of former slave masters and immigrants from Europe. The consequence is a persistence of the more devastating problems that we have as a people, i.e., social, economic, political, and motivational. The image of the Creator sets the tone for the potential of creativity in the human sphere. Those who are alienated from the conception of being in the image of the Creator do not attribute the characteristic of creativity to themselves. Therefore, productivity can at best be imitative of those who are viewed to be in the image of the Creator. Again, the problem stems from a stifled independence based upon the psychological straitjacket of seeing God portrayed as other than self. Lacking in creativity, we are unable to go into our own experience and reap the benefits of our God-given gifts. We laud Freud, but fail to see the value of our own psychological effectiveness in enduring the psychological traumas experienced collectively as an oppressed people. We adore Marx, but fail to recognize the superiority of our intuitive economic theory, which gave us economic sustenance through unity, i.e., synthesis, with minimal resources and in defiance of the Marxist dialect. We apply Dewey's educational philosophy while failing to articulate the dynamics of the feat of our own education in an environment which defied our very literacy. Our failure to study our own reality and utilize the benefits of that reality is a clear defect in our social effectiveness. But our lack of confidence in that reality has its root in our perception that we do not have equal access to the presence of the Creator because He does not look like us. Persistently haunted by this image of divine, we consistently seek out leaders or authorities who approach the appearance of the Caucasian image of divinity. The real irony is the number of highly aware African Americans who are literally locked in intellectually to the authority and intellectual leadership of non-African people. The authority may be Marx, Freud, Skinner, or Jesus, but the underlying basis for the authoritativeness of the figure is his similarity to the Caucasian image. This is not to discredit the presence of viable and effective ideas in each of these and many other European and non-African authorities. A man is no more denied access to truth by its color than one is given chosen access to truth by its color. The problem for African American development as a people is the fact that we tend to reject the authority and leadership of one who is without the Caucasian features, and we rather faithfully and uncritically accept the leadership of authority of anyone who possesses these features. It is almost as if a man with African features cannot be an authority unless he has been authenticated and credentialed by the highest European or Caucasian authorities. Only then is he viewed as an authority. The only exception to this rule is the situation of the fundamentalist minister whose claim to authority is that he, quote unquote, has been called. He then identifies the voice of his quote-unquote calling as being precisely the image about which this discussion is addressing. With such legitimization, he is often given unbridled authority, even when he may not even represent the self-interest of the people he is leading, because he has been quote-unquote called by a figure from the Caucasian imagery of divinity. His word becomes law. The point is the same, whether one is authorized by Harvard or a quote unquote call the source of legitimization is identical. Though the focus of this discussion has been on the situation of African Americans, it is just as true in other cultures where the Euro-Caucasian image of divinity has gone. The African nations most strongly under the influence of this image are least effective in determining their own destiny. They all have quote unquote experts from the other nations telling them what to do, not only with their technology, but with their religion, their social and political philosophy as well. They have limited ability to exercise autonomy in self-government and in respect for indigenous leadership because the highest authority has been identified in non-African appearance. Dr. Edward Blyden makes another relevant observation on the impact of elevating the Caucasian image of God. The Christian Negro, abnormal in his development, pictures God and all beings remarkable for their moral and intellectual qualities with the physical characteristics of Europeans, and deems it an honor if he can approximate, by a mixture of his blood, however irregularly achieved, in an outward appearance, at least, to the ideal, thus forced upon him of the physical accompaniments of all excellence. In this way he loses that sense of the dignity of human nature, observable in his Mohammedan brother. In other words, Dr. Blyden is suggesting that those Christians who have taken on the idea that the only way to be excellent is to be like a Caucasian are the same people who believe that the only qualities that are civilized qualities are those that are associated with Caucasians. Expectations in family life, cultural life, moral life, dress, manners, language, and everything are identified with them as a standard of excellence. Quote, "There is no dignity in being oneself," end quote, suggests Dr. Blyden. Too often the conclusion is reached that the absence of some of these qualities among African Americans and the persisting aping of European mannerisms and culture represents a fundamental deficiency in the character of African people. The arguments suggesting an innate and genetically determined deficit among black people are extensive and compelling. Many of the qualities of self-negation and inadequate social development of African people within a European context can be attributed directly as a consequence of the issues of this discussion. In this regard, Imam Warith Deen Muhammad raises a penetrating question. What would happen to the minds of Caucasian people if black people would suddenly come into power with their mentality, with their love for their religion? What would happen if nappy-headed black Jesuses were put all over their land and throughout their homes and in all of their churches? What would happen to their minds over a period of 300 years if they were kept coming to churches and seeing our image as their Redeemer, seeing our image as their prophets, their apostles, their angels? They would be reduced to inferiority because the image before them of the supreme model of superiority would be black and not white. Imam Muhammad places the problem in the broader context of psychological process in his hypothetical image. The influence of this Caucasian image on the psyches of non-Caucasian people is no worse than would be the influence of a black image on the psyches of non-black people. The reduction of people to a state of inferiority represents a reprehensible form of mind control of the worst kind. It also becomes the basis for ensuring the continued psychological enslavement of any people under such an influence. The solution. There are two modes of attack on this psychologically crippling influence faced by non-white people influenced by Christian societies. One mode of attack involves the removal of the images from the outer world, and the second involves removal of the internalized images from the inner being. The removal of these images from the outer world has been initiated by the thrust of Imam W.D. Muhammad and the CRAID, Committee for the Removal of All Images That Portray Divine, efforts of the American Muslim Mission since the late 1970s. By protests, flyers, public rallies, and publications, direct social action has been taken to raise the critical issue among religious people. There is probably no more significant effort of social reform than this effort to, quote, remove all images and all racial effects from worship, end quote. Such political activity has real relevance in correcting the environment's contribution to the problems which we have discussed above. Removing the images from the society can clearly protect the young children from the influence of such images. We can protect them from this influence on their thinking, which make them view themselves in a distorted and unnatural light. The protection will serve Caucasian young minds who develop an unnaturally inflated image of their self-worth, as well as the young non-Caucasian minds which see themselves as inferior because of these images. Our scholars who address the social and psychological functioning of African American people must take up this issue as one for their scholarship and research. African Jamaican cultural scientist and psychologist Leacham Samaj and others have done some preliminary investigations which demonstrate that young children have a conception that, quote unquote, God is white. University of West Indies, 1980. Such research is critical in beginning to uncover the destructive psychological influences which distort our thinking and our living. Professional organizations dedicated to the unique problems of African Americans must take forthright positions on this issue as well. As the American Medical Society is the voice of authority on health in the Western world, the professional groups of African Americans must be the voice of authority on the mental, social, economical, and political health of African Americans. Such an effort has already been initiated by the National Association of Black Psychologists in a resolution which the world's largest organization of non-Caucasian mental health experts adopted in 1980. This resolution condemned the presence of Caucasian images of divinity as psychologically destructive to the minds of African Americans. Though the resolution passed with some difficulty, the slim majority which accepted the resolution took a landmark stand against clearly the most psychologically dehumanizing and inferiorizing influence in the society. There is a critical need for our experts to more carefully monitor the destructive influences in our physical, mental, social, and spiritual environments. The real challenge, however, is to remove the racial images of divinity from our own minds. The long-term subjection to this image on a subliminal basis has deeply entrenched its influence in our perceptions. The subconscious internalization will make it difficult to recognize its influence. Developing an awareness that the influence of these images is there is the first accomplishment, and the social, organizational, and scholarly efforts described above will facilitate this process. But we must also take self-affirmative steps to transform our own world. We must carefully monitor the images that we expose ourselves to, which perpetuate this destructive influence. For example, we might choose to refrain from uncritically watching a movie such as the Bible, which depicts the entire religious history of the Judeo-Christian world in Caucasian flesh. We must begin to build a reality which conserves the reality of our own experiences. We must develop educational materials, artistic productions, economic structures, fashions, and concepts which deny the implication of our inferiority. Our religious leaders must help us to learn that God, Allah, Jah, Jehovah, Yahweh, etc., deals with us all directly. There is but one Creator who has chosen all of creation within which to manifest His greatness. We have the same responsibility as any other people to develop our independent powers while interacting cooperatively with others. Dependence on others' resources, ideas, and creativity is not necessary when people come to recognize the same potential that the Creator has given to each of us. We need to beg no one if we realize the value of the gifts that we have been given and begin to utilize those gifts, as others do, in a self-affirmative fashion. This realization and these efforts will equip us to begin to overcome the last remaining stronghold of our psychological enslavement. Genuine emancipation of African American people will not be possible until every vestige of Caucasian association with divinity has been removed. Ultimate liberation does not involve substituting an African, black racial image for the Caucasian one. Ultimate liberation recognizes that the form of the Creator is a form superior to human flesh, totally, and the perfected being invites us to a transformed state of perfection larger than material identity. Such transformation will never be possible so long as our aspiration is locked in the frame of a material and, by implication, deficient or incomplete form. End of Racial, Religious Imagery and Psychological Confusion by Naeem Akbar, PhD in Clinical Psychologist.